This is Renita Reed. I'm here in San Antonio, and it is April the 5th, 2018. I'm here with Deb McCrary and
McCrary.
Deb McCrary and Cavett McCrary. And I would like to start with them introducing themselves.
Go ahead, Mom.
My name is Debs McCrary. Been pretty much a lifelong resident of San Antonio. I was away for a few years, but this is home.
And I'm Cavett McCrary, and that is the mirroring story for me. I'm from San Antonio, left for a few years for college, but have returned back to Bexar County.
And can you tell me when you were born, Debs?
I was born in 1953 at Fort Sam. Fort Hood, that's it. I'm sorry. Fort Hood, Texas, which is right outside Killeen, a little bit above Austin, Texas.
And can you tell me something of your background, your parents?
My father was Addis Roberts. He was military, stationed in all over the world, actually. But at the time that I was born, he was stationed at Fort Hood in Killeen. My mother was Gerald Phillips, was her maiden name. She was from Karn City, Texas. And I'm not sure how they met. I think my dad just traveled around the state a lot. And they met and married.
And how far back can you go with your heritage?
Without looking at notes, probably about 4 generations. Yeah. There is a document created by Herbert Smith, who is a relative who's since passed away, but he would chronicle everything, and he could trace it back to a relative who arrived on a slave ship. But I never saw that documentation. I was told that he had it. So.
And I want to get back to Cavett. Tell me when you were born, Cavett, and where you were born.
I was born August 31st, 1988 in downtown San Antonio.
And this is your mother?
Yes, this is my mom.
And tell me your father's name.
My father is Cedric McCrary, and he was born in 1944.
Mm-hmm.
In April of 44, and he was born in San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anything about the McCrarys, that ancestry?
Very little. I know that we have history and family in Kansas, and that my father's father, who's also named Cedric McCrary, although my father is not a junior, was a chemist and a chemistry professor. And my grandmother, my father's mother, was for a long time a secretary. And was it Kelly?
Kelly Air Force Base.
Kelly Air Force Base.
What was her name?
It's a great question.
Well, everybody called her Baby, so, but I think her name was Ruth.
Yes,
and she was Ruth Brody.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
She passed away. All of my grandparents passed away before I was born. So.
And do you know where he was a chemist, where he was professor, the grandfather McCrary?
I know it was in Kansas.
Okay, I never met him. So I'm just trying to think if he was a chemist when he lived here. I don't know.
Oh, I have it on his obituary.
Okay.
Because I did go to his funeral, but I don't know offhand. But I can get that information to you.
And tell me a little bit, Debs, about your upbringing and where you lived.
Well, for the most part, I lived in San Antonio. My mother's from a little town called Karn City, and my grandmother lived there, and she had 11 children. My mom was number 10. She was the first to go to college. And when Mom finished and she married and finally settled in San Antonio, she was working. Worked for the government. She was a biochemist. And so I spent a lot of time in Carson City with my grandmother. When my mother was getting established in the summers, I was always with my grandmother. And that's pretty much how I grew up. Spent summers in Carson City and went to school here in San Antonio.
What was your mother's name?
Jurl, Jerl, Jurl.
And she was a biochemist
Right.
at what was BAMC. What's it? I don't know what it's
Right.
called now.
Which is Brooke Army Medical Center. They've moved it from the main campus of Fort Sam, and now it's called the San Antonio Medical Center or something like that.
SAAACAM.
So instead of Brooke Army Medical, it's San Antonio Medical Center.
You have a lot of scientists in the family.
Yeah, it seems so.
Yeah.
But not me. I only
Let's
passed
stop
chemistry.
there.
Yeah. I only passed chemistry with the help of my mother. Trust me.
What did you do for a living, or what do you do for a living?
I began as a systems engineer for IBM. And that was my first professional job out of graduate school. And worked there for 18 years. And during that time, I picked up writing. I always enjoyed writing. And so I sort of developed that profession a little better. So I still do writing. I'm no longer with IBM. I retired from there. But I write newspaper articles. I'm working on my first novel. And mostly newspapers and magazines and editorials, those kinds of things.
What do you write about?
I like to say anything that pays that isn't illegal or immoral. So if I would be ashamed to have my pastor read it, I probably don't take those jobs.
Tell me about growing up in San Antonio and where you went to school.
I initially went to St. Peter Claver, which is on the east side near what is now, what highway is that? 281, 37. Started there in preschool, and it was run by Catholic nuns. My mother wasn't happy with it because the nuns were very rigid, and you could only go to the bathroom when they said so. And I guess after my second accident, she just said, nope, we're not going back there. So I moved to Mount Zion, First Baptist Church daycare or kindergarten, and started there and loved it. And then went to CUNY Elementary School, which is now Friendship Baptist Church, the same building. And at that point, we moved to the Washington, D.C. area because of another transfer, and lived there, I'm trying to think, fourth, fifth, and sixth grade before coming back to San Antonio. Went to Poe Middle School for a year for seventh grade, and then I was transferred to Incarnate Word High School. So from eighth through graduation, I was in Incarnate Word. Yeah.
What was your experience like? Did you have experienced segregation?
I really didn't understand what that was about because the neighborhood we lived in was all Black. I mean, the pharmacist was Black, the tailor was Black. The only non-Black people in the neighborhood were the people at the corner market, and they were either Korean, some Asian, I don't know what they were, but everybody else, I mean, the movie theater ticket takers and the teachers all lived around the school because I was only a few blocks away from my elementary school. And so there wasn't, I didn't expect anything else. When I went to Carson City to visit with my grandmother, there was a little separation, but I really thought that was because of her work. She cleaned houses, for white families, and that was normal for me. It wasn't until I got outside of San Antonio that I really faced discrimination for the first time. We were driving from San Antonio to Washington because of our move, and we stopped at a gas station to get gas, and I had to go to the restroom. So I popped out and saw a sign on the door, said ladies. I was 8 years old. Said ladies, and I walked up to the door and I was just about to step in, and somebody grabbed me by the collar and literally lifted me up and turned me around. And he says, "Can't you read?" And I was like, "Yes, I can read." And at that point, my mother saw what was happening, and she got out of the car. She said, "I'll take care of it." And so he pointed to a sign that was above my head, and it said "white only," and I never had to deal with anything like that before. So I thought, this is interesting. And Mom said, "I'll take care of it. She's fine." And she took me around the corner to the colored restroom. And then we talked about it from that point, when we left the gas station. So that was very eye-opening.
Did that change you in some ways?
Well, at that young age, I'm not sure, but I just thought, what's so different? A bathroom is a bathroom, but it made me more aware. Yeah.
Were you aware of any other racial incidents that occurred in the area? Any lynchings?
No, I never saw anything like that. I didn't find out until just recently why my mother went to high school in Philadelphia. I mean, I just thought, why, what prompted that? And it just always was. It's one of those things you don't ever ask. It just is. Why is your nickname Bobo? You just don't ask because it just is. And I never asked why my mother did that. And one of her older sisters lived in Philadelphia with her husband, and so that's where my mother went to high school. And I just recently found out that the reason is Karn City did not have an integrated high school. It was all white. So she went to live in Philadelphia to go to high school. Mime, Ira's mother, went to Kennedy, which is another town about 6 miles away from Karn City, so that she could attend high school. I never knew that.
So San Antonio did not have any education for students in high school?
Oh, San Antonio did, but this was
Karn
Karn City, the little town. Yeah. San Antonio had quite a bit and still does.
How far away is Karn City?
It's about a little over 50 miles, south east of here. Yeah.
And what other history of that time sticks out in your memory? Any favorite stories? Anything from childhood?
Now that we're talking about this, I'm thinking about when my grandmother would come up to visit. She would come every spring because we have fiesta here in San Antonio. And we would ride the bus because you can't get into town, you don't want to drive. But we'd ride the bus from our house to downtown, and we had these little folding stools, and we would set up our stools. We'd get there early in the morning in front of a store called Kress, Kress. It's like a 5 and dime. And so we would sit there, and that's where we'd watch the parade. And that was a great memory. Every year we did the same thing. The issue was you sit there all day and you need to go to the restroom. One of the ways that particular store maintained a segregated area without putting up signs was it was a pay toilet. Every toilet had a latch on it, and you put your dime in and then you could go to the restroom, which I thought was really interesting. I always wanted to get an ice cream cone or something at the counter, and my grandmother would say, "Oh, that's not very good. We'll get one later." Again, not knowing that we weren't allowed to sit there. So that was another eye-opener. We shopped at Josky's, which was a local department store, very well known, but we always shopped the basement. Again, I didn't know why. It's just, that's where the good deals were, in the bargain basement. And I think it was 67, 68. There was a big protest about Josky's, and they opened the doors so anybody could eat there because they had a restaurant. That was another thing. And we never ate at the restaurant. I didn't ask why. It just wasn't, But after that protest, and there was a march, people I didn't really know at the time, and Josky's opened up its store. We could shop anywhere within the store. We could eat at the restaurant. Yeah, it's interesting.
68, that just seems like...
Forever?
Well, no, it just seems like by that time I would just assume that things would have been automatically integrated.
No. 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 You would think so, but no. I look at that movie, Remember the Titans?
Mm-hmm.
Remember that? That was about and filmed in Alexandria,
Virginia?
Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in the 70s. And it was very realistic about, white folks didn't want their children going to school with black people, and all the discrimination at the beginning of that film before it came together. I mean, that's a real life story.
Mm-hmm.
But that was in the 70s. So
It makes you realize how recent our history is.
right.
And we were going to talk about Jules Debs too. That wasn't that long ago that
Right.
you have that ancestor.
Mhm.
And I do want to you to tell me his story.
Oh, okay.
So we'll jump to that point.
Okay. Jewel Deems was my great-grandfather. So he was my grandmother's father. And he lived in Karn City. Well, let me back up a little bit. Before there was Karn City and all of our family there's a little, they didn't call it a town. I guess they just called it a community called Flaccus, Flaccus, Flaccus. And it was the black community. So after we learned on Juneteenth about the Proclamation Emancipation, and slaves were freed, there was this community of black people. And that's where my grandfather lived, with his parents. And I'm sure my grandmother came from somewhere in that area. I don't know her background real well. But they lived there, and then eventually moved to Karn City. And I don't know exactly where Flaccus is because it doesn't exist anymore. So I don't know how far away it was from Karn City. But all my grandmother's siblings were born and raised there. Okay. Anyway, so when my grandmother and her dad, Jewel, moved to Karn City, at that point she was an adult. So she had a house where she raised her family, and his house was not even down the road. I mean, it was probably the equivalent of 3 houses over, except there was just a field between the two. So he lived there with his wife, Nanny, and, as I said, by this time all the children were grown. So I never knew Nanny. She passed away before I was born. But Big Papa was just a real part of my life, because I was spending so much time with my grandmother in the summers and when I was young. We got a phone call. I saw Big Papa all the time. And my grandmother fixed his meals. And, so breakfast, lunch, and dinner were always spent with him. And he would walk from his house to my grandmother's house. He is a character. He was hard of hearing in his later years, but he and I worked out our sign language, so I didn't have to walk over there to pick him up. He knew when it was about time to eat, and I was like, so he would come over, and he was quite a character. He always put his napkin in his lap. I thought, I'd never seen that before. He'd always put his napkin in his lap. And he'd say, well, that's because I always feed my lap when I eat, and he'd always drop something.
To get some of these details, did he open up his napkin all the way?
Yes, he did. I mean, just spread it across his lap. And at the end of each meal, there was always a little crumb, some crumbs in his napkin, and he'd.
And those were the days of cloth napkins.
Yes, right. Because you just fold it up and then you take it out. You shake it outside the door, the back door. So that was interesting.
You said that he's a character. What was he like?
He
Tell the Rooster Story.
Oh, about
Or
the gun?
chicken.
Yeah, the chicken.
That's funny.
Yeah. There's so many Papa stories. But this was a time when Nanny was still living. So I obviously wasn't there. But they had chickens, around the house. And Nanny was apparently trying to catch a chicken for dinner. And she had been chasing this chicken around the house and, the outside of the house and couldn't catch him. And she was very frustrated. So she said to, well, I cannot catch this chicken. I'm trying so we can have our dinner. And Big Papa says, run him by that window, And she said, okay. So at some point, the chicken ran by the window, and he was watching her, as she made the rounds. So he had the timing fairly well. And then the chicken came by the window. He pulled out his gun and boom, and just shot the head off the chicken. Or just as clean, it was funny. The story's funny. I didn't see it, but I just thought that was so funny. And I wanted Ira to be here to tell that because he can tell you what kind of gun it was. It was something huge, but through an open window, he killed the chicken and they had chicken for dinner.
Yeah, and in that article that was written by the Express News, it talked about how he was really good with the gun and I don't know if it's considered a marksman, but.
Yeah, he could shoot. He was good. He says one of the best things he ever did, though, was to be a bronco buster. He could tame horses and make them behave. So that was just one of the things he really liked. And the people that he worked with, in doing the Chisholm Trail thing, knew that that's what he was good at. So when they would get to a point where they needed to get more horses, because they were free roaming on the range, say, aren't you out? He'd take care of it.
So tell me that part of things, his work on the Chisholm Trail. Did you hear tales about that?
He was a little closed-mouthed about when they weren't on the trail itself, but he was the cook, so he did all the cooking for the Cowboys. And he, as I said, was the bronco buster. So when they, got to places where they needed more horses, he would, do that. And sometimes he'd help round up the cattle that they were trying to move to market. But for the most part, he was the cook and, the bronco buster.
Now, did he go the whole Chisholm Trail? He would travel with the wagon?
Yes, and mostly to move cattle, to the market. It wasn't necessarily to move people, but to move cattle. And when they would stop, of course there was segregation. And that's where he became very closed-mouthed. And I think all his life, he died in the 60s, all of his life, there's stories he would never tell us because he still thought that, you could hang for that. They could string you up for telling white people's business. But he saw people get shot over, saloon ladies, he called them, arguments and all kinds of issues. But he would never, ever tell those stories.
And isn't that unusual for a bronco buster to also be the cook? It sounds like an interesting combination.
Right. Well, I guess he had to have something to do when he wasn't preparing meals. And they knew he was good at it, so.
Do you know how he became good at that? Did you hear any tales?
No, I didn't. I really.
Now, he was born, when was Truth?
I think it was 1863. Or maybe, I get the dates mixed up. It's either 63 or 65. But either way, he didn't know he was free. Apparently his family didn't know.
What were the tales that you heard about his family, his parents?
I don't know an awful lot about his side. I know a little bit more about his wife's side, Nanny. And it's Nanny who we can trace back to right off the boat. But I don't have that documentation. We've suffered several losses in the last few years of the historians, and we don't really know where everything is. But for Nanny's line, there were the Eckfords. She was an Eckford, Eckford, Eckford. Louis Eckford and Eliza Eckford were born slaves, became free. Louis, very intelligent, purchased some land, quite a bit of land. And then this is something I think runs in our family. He started suffering from dementia. But at the time, they didn't call it that. It wasn't Alzheimer's. It wasn't dementia. They just said he was a lunatic, right? And that was just the common term. So he needed to be put away. And Eliza, I don't remember how many children they had, but she sort of took over. But that was a big task to run the farm and, you know, take care of everything with no expertise. I mean, she'd always been the mom in the house, you know, and preparing food and taking care of the kids. So there was some question as to, you know, who's going to do this? And so that, I mean, and then that's still probably a bone of contention with the family. It's like, well, who owns this land? It still belongs to us. And I've seen documents about transfer of pieces of that property, you know, having to sell off pieces to pay taxes and to raise a family. And they're all handwritten because there are no typewriters back then. But it's interesting to see legal documentation that's all written by hand. So.
This is in Kearney?
Karnes County. Might have been Flaccus.
Flaccus.
I don't know. I don't remember seeing on there.
But the same land that's now in Kearney?
Flaccus was near Karnes City. I don't know yeah, Karnes. Yeah. So I'm not sure how far away it was.
And who was it that was the slave that you said you can go back to slave?
Right, and I don't know that name.
Is it in your papers? No.
Was there something in Gabby's paper?
Yes, I don't know who it was, but it does date back to who was the first to come off of a slave ship.
Okay, yeah.
So.
Sarah, yeah. Okay, she's 22 years old, full-blooded African, brought along her full-blooded African son, John, who was about 4 or 5 years old. Okay. So that was, well, that says more than a century and a half ago. So no specific date. And this was written in 1980. So.
It's amazing to have that.
Right.
That knowledge.
Right. So, and the homecoming that we have is based on her. And of course, you know, there's like branches everywhere. So when we have that homecoming, there's not just the Phillips and the Deems, there's the Smiths and the Sullivans and, you know, people. I would go to these things and I was like, what are you doing here? You know, I was like, well, this is my homecoming. I was like, you got to be kidding. You know, we were related. I didn't know that. One of the real ironies was Cedric, her dad, had a daughter when he was in high school, didn't know about it. And she came to visit after Cedric and I were married. And she was a grown woman by then. Her name's Becky. And I said, well, what are you doing here? You know, why are you in town? You know, visiting your grandparents, because her parents no longer lived in San Antonio. And she said, yeah, but we're having some kind of family reunion or something. And I came for that. Okay. So the reunion was in Runge, Texas, which is about 60, 70 miles away from San Antonio. And we go there, and there's Becky. And I just said, wow, I guess we're related by blood anyway. You know, even though you're not my child, and I'm married to your dad, your biological father. So, but those homecomings were for everybody who, was descended from Sarah. Yeah.
I'm curious also, did recipes pass down in the family?
Ramen
from
toast.
the
I hadn't thought about that in a long time. I'm not a cook, as my daughter can attest. My grandmother was a great cook and a great pastry chef. But by the time my mother, I told you Mama Navi had 11 children. By the time my mother came along, she was number 10. My grandmother didn't want people in her kitchen anymore. So my mother didn't learn to cook. So I didn't learn to cook. So I have none of her recipes, none at all. But the only thing that you just brought up was what we call Mama Navi toast. Navi is my grandmother's name, my mother's mother. And we called her Mama Navi. But she didn't have a toaster, so you made toast in the broiler in the oven. So she'd take the bread, put the butter on it, and stick it under the broiler, and watch it, and that's what we had. So we always call that Mama Navi toast.
Yeah,
that's the only recipe.
And would you just toast it on one side?
Yes.
And on I remember that a lot as a kid. I thought about that a few weeks ago. I was like, I wonder how you make Mama Navi toast, because I ate it a lot as a kid, but I never made it. But now I know it's just bread and butter.
Bread and butter, stick it under the broiler. That's it.
But I was also wondering if with Big Papa, if his being on the Chisholm Trail, was there anything that passed down from him being a cook?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't remember him ever cooking anything. I mean, my grandmother fixed all his meals. I really don't remember. But he was such a nice, gentle man. We used to sit on the porch at my grandmother's house in the evenings, and there's nothing to do in Garden City. But there are no big lights, So when the sun goes down, you could see all the stars, and he'd point those out, and well, this is the North Star, and it's just really interesting. He was a nice, gentle man, and I'd ask him about things, and like, you gonna fly? Nope. Don't need to be up, off the ground. Not going to do that. Fascinated that we went to a grocery store, and as we approached it, the door slid open. That was a big deal. He'd never seen anything like that before. So.
Did he have a horse in Carnes?
At some point, yes. They had, the little farmhouse, and like I said, they raised chickens, and they had a cow, and, he had a horse. I should have brought that picture. I've got a picture of him on a horse. And he taught at least Ira and they would be great-grandkids to him to ride. Yes, so he's very comfortable around horses.
Do you know the name of that horse?
No, I don't.
Did he suffer from having been a bronco buster? Did he have ailments?
No, he really didn't. He had a cane, but at that point, he was in his 90s when he and I, spent a lot of time together, bordering on 100. And he had a cane, and he was hard of hearing. We always had to talk really loud, which I think is another funny story. One of my cousins had a little juke joint, if you will, in Carnes City. And on some nights, Big Papa would go to the juke joint, He didn't drink, but he'd go just because people were dancing and, they were serving beer and people got lively. Maybe he'd play dominoes or something. And inevitably, some young woman would come over and say something to him, and he said, "Sit down, I'll buy you a soda water," right? So he'd buy a soda or whatever it is that she was drinking. And then they'd engage in this conversation. And, this close, and nobody was shouting. We're like, now, wait a minute. Why do we have to shout for him to hear us? But he can hear this woman talking, he was just funny that way, And he said, "Oh, I hear her. She's fine." and there's music in the background and people talking and nobody has to holler at him. It's like, Papa, let's do this. It's funny.
That sounds like a character.
Yeah.
What other stories do you have about him? Is there something else that sticks out?
Not really. I mean, he loved to laugh. He loved family.
It did say in the article that he never learned to read, but he did like to do poetry.
Yeah, he learned to read late in life. I knew that. And he did write poetry. And I've got a sample of something that he wrote. I didn't bring it with me. But his baby daughter's name was Jewel. So it was like Jewel, except it was only one L. So he was Jewel, and then there was Jewel. So the first time I saw this poem, it said, it was printed as if it had been in a magazine or something, a book, and it said by Jewel Deems. And I thought, well, Big Papa couldn't have written this. It must be Jewel, and they just, put the extra L in there. But no, it was his. It was Jewel's. It was very pretty. I was really surprised.
What was the topic of it?
It's been so long since I looked at it. I'd have to go back. I hate to comment on it and get it all wrong, but it was very eloquent. I was surprised. I thought, well, I wonder if he handwrote that or he just dictated it to somebody. But just the fact that he was creative enough to do that. Yeah.
Did he, I think about on the trails, on like the Chisholm trails, the Cowboys singing. Did he sing? Did he do any?
I've never heard him sing. I never heard him sing at all. But he didn't talk about that a whole lot. And again, the secrecy, to like Las Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But I think it was just that fear of retaliation, that slipping somebody's name by mistake or inadvertently describing some piece of something that happened that could fall back on him, So he was very protective of not only himself, but his family. He didn't want any repercussions for his family based on what he might have seen or done while he was out. So, the only thing I do know, the name that he brought up, and I think it was in that newspaper article, Bing Choate was the trail boss, Shoat, Bing Choate. And he seemed to have good admiration for him, but I think Choate sort of ruled the roost there and said, this is a no-no and that's okay.
And were there other cowboys that came to the house that you remember visiting him?
No. At that point, as I said, Big Papa was in his 90s, when he and I were pretty close. So he didn't get many visitors other than family. Yeah. And then after a while, it became problematic for him to take care of himself in that house. It wasn't central air. He had a wood-burning pipe stove, that went up through the ceiling. So it just became a problem for him to try to keep himself warm. And so we moved him to San Antonio.
Could I ask you to tell the Rooster Story again? There was some adjustment that was going on or something happened during that. Do you mind?
Oh, no, not at all.
it?
I wish I knew the caliber of the gun. I don't know anything about guns, so. But, the idea was that Nanny, Big Papa's wife, wanted to have a chicken for dinner. And they had chickens right there on the property, on the farm. And she selected the chicken she wanted, and she was trying to catch it. And she couldn't. She tried and tried, and she was getting frustrated. And so she whined to Big Papa, Jewel, I can't catch this chicken. I wanted to have him for dinner. And so he says, oh, run him by the window. So he's inside the house, she's outside chasing this chicken. He got the timing right as she made her way around the house. And then as that chicken passed the window, he just pulled out a gun and shot at the chicken through an open window and just blew his head off. So they had chicken for dinner.
Thank you for restating it. Something's
Sure.
always happening when we're trying to get that story. But
I think Ira can tell it a whole lot better. Ira's a good storyteller. His mother was a great storyteller, Wilma, but she's since passed away.
Just looking at the time, I think we're doing good. I wanted to see what else we can capture to add to your family story. Do you want to look at these and see if there's something that sticks out that will be a story that comes to mind?
Well, I don't know. I'm just thinking. Probably some of the stories I know probably shouldn't be told.
But that's okay. I mean, that might be a chance to preserve that story for the future, if you're willing to state it.
I just remember a funny story Aunt Ruth told. As I said, my grandmother and grandfather had so many children, and they lived in a small house. You wonder, how do you manage a family that big with such a small house? But Aunt Ruth, and I have to look at the lineage. Yeah, here we go. So it must have been Aunt Ruth, Zerlene, we called her Toot, and Catherine. So maybe it was the three of them. But they all slept together in the same room, probably in the same bed. And it just seemed that there were new children all the time. That, Mom Navi was always pregnant. And so Aunt Ruth said in the middle of the night, if they would hear the bed springs rocking in the next room, that they'd start coughing and say, "Oh, my stomach hurts," to make it stop. It's like, no, we don't need any more children in the house. Okay. But
Do you know how big the house was?
Square footage? I really couldn't say. It was bedroom, and when I was coming up, the room that held Aunt Ruth and her siblings had been converted to the living room because there was no living room before. There was still a bed in it, but there was a sofa and a dresser and a big lamp. Then there was a dining room and a kitchen. And then there was a back bedroom, but it was very narrow. I mean, extremely narrow. It was just wide enough for maybe a double bed. So that's why I'm saying I don't know how all those people fit in there. And Mama Navi's house did not have a bathroom. When I was coming up, there was the outhouse, in the back of the house, and that's where we went to the restroom. So, and there was also no bathtub. So there was a big round, steel tub. We'd bring that in, and Mom Navi would heat the water on the stove. Yes, heat the water on the stove, and then pour the water in the tub, and that's where we bathed, in the middle of the kitchen. Yeah.
So is that like with the "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater"?
Exactly. And I always thought that was a joke, but the way it worked was it was bath day. When Papa says now he took a Saturday bath, okay, because everybody didn't bathe every day. It was too cumbersome to try to do that. But the pecking order was the man in the house bathed first, okay, and then the mother, and they're in the same water, okay, and then the children, by age. And so when they say don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, by the time the baby got to it, the water was pretty raunchy, right? So it's like, make sure there's no kids in this water before you pick up the tub and, throw it out the back door. So, yeah. But anyway, the youngest child, whose name is Jarvis, he was the second person to go to college. He was into data processing, and he moved to Washington, D.C. after he finished college, started his own business, and he had come to visit his mother. He said, "This is ridiculous." So he had built onto the house a bathroom, and it had a tub and a toilet and a sink. And it was a big deal. I tell you, that was a big, and a closet in there. It's like one whole wall was nothing but a closet. So Mom and I had a place to put all those hats from church and hang her clothes up. But that was just major. And I was probably 9 or 10 when that happened. So up until that time, I bathed in the kitchen and went to the restroom and outhouse out back. Yeah.
Tell me about the role of religion, faith in your family.
Oh, everybody went to church. I mean, that was the rule. Yeah, you go to church on Sunday, and it was all day. It was like there was Sunday school, and then main service. You come home for dinner, and then you go back after, lunch. So church would end about 1:30. Come home, you eat. Maybe you'd rest for a few minutes, but then you go back for afternoon service that went on into the evening. I never learned anything about tithing and what that was, but they called them church dues. I never knew what Mom Navi put in, but I knew she didn't make a lot of money cleaning houses. And she told me that I needed to give as well. So I had a handkerchief, cute little handkerchief, and Mom Navi would put a nickel in the corner of one and tie it up, and she'd put a penny or two in the other end, and tie that up. And at church services, there are always two offerings. The first one was a benevolence offering, and that money went to people in need. So I'd, untie the end that had the pennies, and that's when you walk around and you put your money in the offering plate. That's what I do. And then for the main offering, I'd untie and put the nickel in. So.
That's interesting, tying it into the napkin.
Yeah, make sure you don't lose it. But my grandmother's church was called Church of the Living God, the Pillar and Ground of the Truth. And it was nearly in her backyard. At the end of her property, there was a big field and then a road, and the church sat on that road. You could see the church from her back door. There was also a Baptist church that was in town, which is closer to the post office, and Speedy Petey, the grocery store. That's in town, but that was the Baptist church. And there was no pastor who lived in Carn City. Pastors commuted from San Antonio or surrounding areas. So every other Sunday was a service at a different place. So the main service. Now, there was always Sunday school at my grandmother's church. But for the worship service, one week it was at the Baptist church, and the next week it was at, Church of God. But yes, you went to church.
And how did your family celebrate holidays?
We would have, dinner, and everybody would come to my grandmother's house. And again, with all of her children who could come and their children. I mean, it was pretty crowded. So we ate in shifts because the house wasn't that big. A lot of times the kids would eat outside on the porch. Let's see, Edie's dad, Uncle Bubba, lived in Corpus Christi. So he would come with his wife, Aunt Laura, and they had 2 children. Flanoy Jr., we called him Flip, and Edie. They'd come, and then there was still one daughter who lived in Carn City, and her children. It was really interesting. I still find that interesting. We call Mama Navi, as I understood it, because she had, as I said, 11 children. Her first daughter had 3 daughters who were born at the same time as Mama Navi's last 3 children. So 9, 10, and 11 are the same age as the first daughter's 3 daughters. So when either one of those 6 would say, Mama, which Mama? Is it Nalvi you're asking for or Lois? So that's why it became Mama Nalvi and Mama Lois, right? So I just always found that really interesting that my mother, was the aunt to somebody who was older than she is. I just thought that was awkward, but it all worked out. So, but some of them still live in Carn City. So, we get together on holidays, and my Aunt Wilma, Meme, would come from San Antonio and bring her family. So, there might be 25 people there, for Thanksgiving, but you eat in shifts.
How do you spell Navi?
Nolvia. Don't ask. I have no idea. But that's what she called herself, Nalvi. It looks like Nalvia, but she never called herself that. So
I'm not about to
Yeah.
say anything with the spelling of my
Yeah.
name.
Okay.
And what did they fix for the Thanksgiving?
Oh, just pretty much traditional. We always had turkey and a ham. My grandmother was, as I said, was great with pies and cakes. So we always had sweet potato pie and caramel cake when Uncle Sonny could come in from Washington, because that was his favorite, and he was the baby. So she always had to make that cake. Potato salad, peach cobbler for sure. That was always my favorite, to watch her make that and help peel the peaches. That was good. Green beans. It's just pretty standard. Cranberry sauce.
And how about for Christmas? How did your family celebrate? What did you get for gifts?
Now, at Christmas, we did not go to my grandmother's. I think everybody pretty much stayed wherever it is that they lived. I don't remember ever spending time with my grandmother on Christmas. But, we celebrated here in town, and we had an aluminum tree, because we didn't buy a new fresh tree every year. We had an aluminum tree with a color wheel that sat on the floor, and it would rotate colors so that the aluminum tree could change colors with the, simulation of lights instead of hanging bulbs on it, or stringing lights on it. It was just a color wheel.
Was this a small aluminum tree?
No, I mean, it was, 5 feet tall maybe. It was taller than I was.
Did it have holes in it so the lights would shine outward?
No, it was one big pole that had holes in it, and the leaves were just like stems, and you put the stems in the hole, and when it was all done, it was a full tree.
So like those silver trees?
Yes.
Oh, okay,
Yes.
I know what you're talking
Right,
about.
and so we'd put balls on it, but in order to simulate the lights, there was a color wheel that was probably about that big that sat on the floor that you plugged in, and then the wheel would rotate and the light behind it would shine onto the tree, and it looked like you had, it was red, and then it was blue, then it was green, And it saved money, and it was easy to put together. I could do by myself. Yeah. So I remember the house we had on Spruce Street at the time is when I stopped believing in Santa Claus, because my mom would send me, I didn't know it was my mom. I thought it came from Santa, a Western Union telegram every year that said, I've been watching you all year. You've been a good girl, and I know you want whatever it is that I'd ask for, so you just, stay being a good girl until Christmas. Love, Santa, and so I'd want to leave out cookies and milk, the traditional thing. And Mom would always make sure the door was locked. I was like, well, how is he going to get in? And she said, oh, he finds a way. I was like, we don't have a chimney. We didn't have a fireplace at the house, so she said, don't worry about it. So I thought that was just a little ludicrous, but, in the morning, of course, the cookies were gone. The milk glass was still there, with nothing in it. There were crumbs on the cookie plate. And I said, I think there's something to this. It's just not quite right. How does it get to everybody's house and everybody doesn't have a chimney? I think I stopped believing in Santa Claus when I was about 7.
Tell me a little bit more about growing up in that time period. What was your neighborhood like?
My mom, well, when we first moved from Fort Hood, we moved in with my Aunt Wilma, who had a boarding house. And we got the back room of the boarding house. And, you know, of course, she and her husband had other boarders in the house. So that was a little, I mean, it was normal because that's all I knew by the time I was walking and, you know, my dad was no longer in the picture. Then we moved to a rental house. So those are the Christmases that I remember most. And in that block, there was a house next door had a mother, a grandmother, and one child who was a little bit younger than me, girl. And across the street was a mother, father. They were on that corner. They had a daughter named Diane. And then across the street were the Armsteads, yeah, who were my babysitters when Mom had to do something. On this side was Dorothy. They had a parrot that they kept on the porch. And that parrot learned my mother's name. And every day when she'd go to work or come outside, "Hi, Gerald, hi, Gerald." I remember that. And then a couple doors down was another family that had 3 daughters. And I was just telling this to a friend not long ago because he asked me something about someone who passed away recently and, you know, that lived near me. You know, did you know him? And I said, no. And I thought about it and I said, there are no boys on my street. They're all girls. You know, and I never thought about that before, you know, that there were just no little boys. And I had boundaries. I was not allowed to go beyond Patsy's house because she was on the corner. And I can't remember what was on the other corner, but that was Iowa Street. So I had to stay in that one block, you know, so that's who I played with. You know, I learned to ride a bicycle with, you know, without the training wheels on the street. Yeah, it was interesting. It was really interesting.
What was your street address?
Gosh. I want to say.
Or what?
It was on Spruce Street. I'm just trying to remember the actual address. I drove by there a few weeks ago and I didn't even recognize it. They've redesigned the front of the building, you know, so there was no porch that I used to, you know, sit on. I took my brownie pictures sitting on those steps. I had my Easter outfit. Yeah. My Easter outfit, you know, standing on the porch.
Is that where you were doing your roller skates with your
Oh no, that was
jumping?
That was a dumb thing. That was in Washington.
Oh, okay.
That was something else. But Mrs. Armstead was just such a character. She, sometimes when Mom would go out, I'd have to take my bath to go to bed before I went to bed in her house. Well, I don't know if it was economics or what, but she would only put like this much water in the tub, wouldn't let me use bubble bath. And I just thought, you know, Mom, I need to bathe at home because Ms. Armstead won't let me really have a bath. And then she'd come over sometimes and she'd be sitting in the living room. And Mom kept the blinds drawn and the curtains drawn. And Miss Armstead said, open those blinds so I can see. And my mom would say, what do you need to see? She said, I don't know, but, you know, I can't see it sitting in here with the blinds closed. You know, so that was always fun. And Mr. Armstead was into recycling paper. So people save their newspapers in boxes and stuff. And when you'd first get to the corner at Iowa and Spruce Street with his truck, all the little girls would run down there and he'd let us sit in the back of the truck and he'd come up the street and turn in his driveway. And we just thought that was the biggest thrill to sit in the back of the truck with all those newspapers that he would then, you know, take and sort and tie and bundle and then go sell.
You said that it was at Wilma's boarding house. What
Yes.
was her last name?
Well, she was a Phillips as her maiden name, but she was a Hunter. Yeah, Wilma Hunter. She married Eddie Lee Hunter, and he and his brother Creighton began a store here in town called Hunter Brothers Upholstery, and they refinished furniture. They're very good at it and did furniture for some of the more prominent, residents of San Antonio. And then after Wilma, I called her Meme, only because I couldn't say Wilma May when I was a little girl. So it came out Meme. She became basically the office manager. So she'd take the orders, the calls. She'd go make the visits, take the fabrics to find out what they wanted to do, and then bring all that back. She'd have somebody go with her to load the furniture on the truck, and then they'd come back, and Creighton and Uncle Eddie would, recover the furniture, whatever it was. And I always found that fascinating because there's a hammer that looks like a woodpecker's head, and one end of it is magnetic. And so Uncle Eddie would stretch the fabric over the sofa, and then he'd have to nail it down before they put the braid on it. And he kept the nails in his mouth, the tacks. And, so he'd tap it and put the end of that hammer toward his mouth, and it would pick up a nail, And I mean, it was amazing how fast he could do that. And I just thought, that's dangerous, heaven forbid if you have to cough or something, But he was very, very good at it. Yeah.
Do you know when he started the upholstery business?
I don't. I mean, it was just always there. It used to be on New Braunfels Avenue.
On where?
New Braunfels Avenue, which is, a few blocks up this way, east of here. It was right next door to Mr. Guerra's gas station. And then they moved to Commerce and Mesquite or Cherry, but not too far from here, right up the street.
It was Hunter's upholstery?
Hunter Brothers. Yeah. And there were several brothers. Creighton and Eddie, Uncle Eddie, were the ones who did the upholstery. There was another brother who had a dry cleaning business. And then a fourth brother, what did he do? I don't remember.
So how did Ira have last name Smith?
Meme was married prior to Uncle Eddie. She was married to an Ira Smith.
Oh, so he was a junior?
Yes.
Oh.
I think his father was out of Houston.
But did he consider Uncle Eddie his stepdad or dad?
That's an interesting question. He didn't really know his dad. And it seems like by the time Meme married Uncle Eddie, I don't know what age Ira and Budget were, but he was just a fixture as far as I knew. I never knew any different. When Ira, my cousin, decided to get married, he'd been dating the same woman for quite a long time, and she already had children. She had a boy and a girl, and they were they were younger than me, maybe about Gabby's age. But she already had children, and Ira had never been married. And so he was a little concerned about marrying somebody who already had children. So he went to Uncle Eddie, which I thought was just so ironic, because Uncle Eddie's the second husband. And he came into that marriage, with two boys. Meme already had the two boys. So Ira goes to Uncle Eddie and he says, I really want to marry Marvinette, but she's got those kids, and I just don't know about, marrying into a ready-made family. And he goes, excuse me? What did you say? And Ira didn't get it. So he repeated what he said. And at that point, I just looked at him, he's like, oh yeah. And it's worked out beautifully. They got married. They had 3 more children, and one of those children is in North Carolina. She just recently had surgery, so that's why Ira and Marvinette aren't here. They went to take care of Tedra's children while she's in the hospital. But I just thought that was so funny.
Tell me about your education and your career.
Okay.
Yeah, get some water.
Yeah, I'm getting a little dry here. Here, you take that so I don't get water. I'm pretty clumsy. You are going to edit this, right?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
This will never be used just like this.
Okay.
And also turn it on
That is a
if you're
full
more
bottle.
comfortable.
Put that down because that is a very full bottle. My education is kind of weird. I went to CUNY Elementary School, which was an all-black school. The principal was black, all the teachers were black, all the students were black. So for first, second, and third grade. Then we moved to Washington, D.C., and I went to, I'm trying to remember the name of that school. I was only there for a year. Can't think of it, but it was in Southeast D.C. Not a happy experience for me there, only because there were standardized tests, and I'd never had one before. And I didn't know what to expect. You weren't allowed to ask questions, and I didn't do well there. It was also when they started teaching cursive, and I wasn't any good at that either. It was just a real unhappy year for me.
What year was that, do you know?
Let's see. That's for 60. So that would have been 63, 64 during that era. Then we moved to Fort Meade, Maryland, which is just right outside of D.C. And so for those 2 years, I was on a military post, Army post. And so I did 5th and 6th grade there. And that was okay. That was interesting. I like that. It's the first time I'd ever had a male teacher, and it was integrated. It's the first time I'd been in a school where there were, white kids, because the school in D.C. was also all black. And then we moved back to San Antonio. I went to Poe Middle School, and that was a mixed race school, so that was okay. My mom, the biochemist, had been working at Fort Meade as a civil servant. Well, when we moved to San Antonio again, there were no openings for that position. So she said, well, I'll just substitute teach, somewhere until, positions open. And so it just so happened that she became a substitute teacher at the school that I was attending. And she taught math for 9th grade. I was in the 7th grade. And because Mom had remarried, she had a different last name than I did. So nobody knew that was my mother. And she was very observant. And because I was the new kid, a lot of people didn't like me or know me, so they decided they didn't like me. And so my mom saw the way that I was treated, and she didn't like that. So I only went there 1 year. And at that point, she put me in a Catholic school. So from 8th grade to graduation, I was at Incarnate Word High School. So that was
she loved.
I did. At the time, I thought it was going to be weird, but I really did. I'm glad I did that. It was a wonderful experience. I tried leaving once, but that didn't work out. But yeah, I enjoyed that. And there's probably about a dozen of us from our class who still get together occasionally.
What's the name of it?
Incarnate Word. Yeah, it was Catholic high school. And so after that, I went to Georgetown University in Washington for undergrad, and then I went to Michigan State and got my master's. So,
and when did you graduate from Georgetown?
1975, and from Michigan State in 1976.
And what was your degrees?
I have a BS in linguistics and a Master's of Arts in telecommunications. Yeah.
And tell me about getting to IBM and working there.
Well, that was sort of a fluke. At Michigan State, they had what they call Women's Career Day, and they were inviting all women just come take a look. And they reserved a big space, and it was like a business show. And so IBM was there, and Hewlett-Packard, and Johnson, and Scott Paper. Just all kinds of corporations. And I thought I was really interested in using television as a medium to teach. And I wanted to base something on Sesame Street that would teach standard English to folks who didn't speak standard English, whether it was because, they spoke Black dialect or, were newly learning English. I wanted to find a way to teach that through television. So that's why I did the telecommunications thing. And I knew there wouldn't be anybody there for that, but a friend wanted to go, and she's like, I don't want to go by myself. And I was like, I'll go with you, And so everybody gets all dolled up, with their best clothes. And I knew there wouldn't be anybody there for me, so I went in jeans and tennis shoes. I did not get dressed up at all. And I went and I, kind of dawdled and went here and there. And I passed by the IBM booth, and there was a woman in the booth who's fairly young. And she's like, "You, come here." I was like, "What?" And she says, "Do you want to work for IBM?" And I was like, "I have no idea. I can't tell you, a computer from an air conditioner. I'd never used one, even though this was the 70s. And she said, "Well, just come talk to me for a minute, and, or let me talk to you." So she told me a little bit about it. And she said, "Well, could you at least come in for an interview with a marketing manager?" Okay, I can do that. But again, I'm in jeans and tennis shoes. I'm nothing like a corporation. I've got an afro, Anyway, so I did that. I went in, I met the marketing manager, and, he seemed to like me. He said, "Well, we have an entrance exam, a qualifying exam that you need to take, and we'll go from there." So I came in a week later, I took the test, and it was just awkward. And I thought, I've never taken a test like this before. It was nothing like the SAT. It's, English and math. There was a lot of logic, puzzle solving. There were some calculations, which I'm not good at math. And I left, and I was like, boy, now all of IBM knows that I'm a total nut, that I'm really dumb. I didn't do anything, learn anything in school. And they called me about a week later, and they said, "You're in. That's the highest score we've ever had anybody score on a test." I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Really? Because I really thought it was difficult. But, and people ask me now, "How'd you get in?" Well, that's how I got in. But I think they were also looking for women, and they were also looking for Black folks, because it was very few in that office. And the ones who were there were not the professionals. They were receptionists or the mailroom clerk. They weren't marketeers. They weren't systems engineers, which is what, I was going to be trained to do. So, is that affirmative action? Yes. And I'll admit it. I really believe that that's how I got in. I did well on the test. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have gotten in. But the fact that I was Black and a woman mattered. So.
And what were some of your great accomplishments there?
At IBM, I survived. I learned a lot. I found racism there. I found discrimination there, and not always because of my race. I was disappointed in some of the management that they were allowed to get away with things that they did, that they would not take advice given freely. It was about the numbers. We got to get these numbers. We got to make this quota. And I saw things that I just didn't want to see. So, but I got a well-rounded education. Because of what I did, I got to move around in different industries. So I spent a couple of years in manufacturing, and a couple of years in hospitals, and a couple of years in education. So I learned a lot about different things, and it did me well when I left IBM and I was teaching a class to a group called Christian Women's Job Corps. And this is for disenfranchised women who, for whatever reason, just never made it. But they realize that they need something else in order to do well. And so I did the business part. Here's how you make a resume. Let's practice interview skills. Let's go out in the field and visit companies so that you can see people who look like you doing this job. You can do this. And so I use that background within IBM to help with that. Now tell me, what do you want to do? Well, I want to work at, a manufacturing plant. Well, because I had that experience, I could talk about here's what they do, here's what they look at. These are the kinds of things you need to go on the internet now, because now it's, 90s. Learn all you can about the company, be able to speak their language, here's some terms you need to know. So that part really helped me. Yeah, I was glad about that.
How long were you with IBM?
18 years. 18 years. And I had a medical debacle. I had a surgery that left me paralyzed from the neck down. And the prognosis was that I'd never walk again. So IBM put me on disability retirement, And even that turned out to be a blessing, because it allowed me to see things I hadn't seen before and do things and do more community work. So that really turned out to be a blessing.
And you recovered.
Yes. And I still can't run and jump, but, it's all right. Yeah.
I don't think we covered your father's military career. What did he do?
That's a good question. My dad was a bit of a Lothario, let's just say. It turns out he liked multiple women more than he liked one. So my parents were divorced before I ever turned a year old. And I did not really know him. I remember seeing him once when I was about 6 or 7. I went to my after-school daycare. There was a woman who lived down the street from the school. And my mother would pick me up when she got off work. And I remember coming in one day, and there's this man. I'd seen a picture, and I was like, boy, that kind of looks like the guy I know is my dad, but I don't know him. And he talked to my mom, found out where I'd be. And so I really met him for the first time. I didn't really know him. And then the next time I saw him, he was retiring from the Army in Fort Belvoir, Virginia, which just happened to be right down the street from where we were stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. So I attended his retirement. He wasn't married at the time, so I got the flowers. I thought that was pretty neat. I was 10. And then he was headed back to Texas, and it was summer. And so Mom said, you're going to stay with your grandmother this summer? I said, yeah. She said, well, there's your dad. So I hitched a ride with him, and it was a Nat or something. We drove back to Texas. Yeah. So, and I can't tell you a whole lot about him. I didn't know his family, but on that ride, we went to one of his family reunions, and I saw and met cousins I'd never known about. Learned a lot about them, but he was usually pretty closed-mouthed about what he did. I mean, he served his time. He was in Korea and, different places. I knew Texas very well, but he was just a ladies' man. And I think my mom was probably wife number 3. And all told, he was married 7 times.
What was his name again?
Addis, Addis, Addis Roberts.
When you say that you were stationed places, was it with his travel?
No, it was with my stepfather. Yeah. And I definitely don't know anything about him. I don't think he knows or knew anything about him. He was adopted by an older couple when he was a baby. They lived in Wilmington, Delaware. I remember traveling there a few times when we lived in Maryland, just because it was so close. But no. Gabby's dad.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now that we've made a circle, is there anything about Big Papa that is coming to mind that we didn't talk about?
No, and I don't know an awful lot about his background, which, I find a little disconcerting. I mean, that I know more about Nanny, his wife, than I do about him.
And you don't know where the Deems name came from?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't know anything about the slavery part of it, what that family was like, where it was. I don't know any of that.
Did he say where he was born?
No, I mean, I know it was Texas, but I just don't know where. See, and that's why I was hoping Ira might be here because, he knows more than I do, and I think prompted, he could probably tell you a lot more. And that's one of the sad things, if you don't ask when people are around, there's nobody to ask later, I mean, my mother's nickname was Fatty, and I always thought Faddy, but I saw, after she passed, and I saw a letter that had been written, and it was Fatty. And I thought, why in the world would they call my mother Fatty? Unless it was, to be facetious, because I've never seen a picture of her where she was fat. I've never seen a baby picture of her. I've never seen a baby picture of her, but, I have that picture with Uncle Bubba and
Come on. Did
Sonny?
you have a question?
Is this the room for the interview?
It is. Or
Do you want me to wait out here?
yes, and I'll be right with you. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah, but it's just, why? Every picture I have of her, even when she was 10, 12 years old, she's skinny. So I'm just thinking maybe somebody being facetious. Okay.
Did any questions come to your mind while I've been asking? Since you've been listening, I'll check in with you to see if you had a question for your mom or.
Not that I can really think of. I mean, I think do you know when your dad was born? What year?
I don't know how much older he is than my mom. It was 19-something teen. I just don't know what that teen is. My mom was born in 1930.
And what year did she pass?
In 1977.
And when did he pass?
In 1983.
83.
Right after I married your dad.
And he died of lung.
He died of
Cancer?
lung cancer. My mom was killed in a car accident.
Right.
In 77, yeah. So, I think my biggest regret is that my children never met either grandparent, biological grandparent. Matter of fact, when Drake discovered,
Drake's my brother.
yeah, Drake's my son. When he discovered where your grandfather was, your dad's dad, it turned out that what he was reading was his obituary. He had just passed away. I mean, Drake had decided he wanted to find, his grandfather, and he just passed away. And so Drake and Cavett went to Kansas to the funeral and met, cousins they didn't even know they had.
Yeah, because my father was raised by his stepfather, and my father did not like his biological father, and so just never mention that he was alive or that there was such a man that existed at all. And so by the time that we found out about him, it was, I guess, too late, really. But I did get to see, what he looked like and, meet some of that family and hear some of that lineage. But yeah, I mean, to our knowledge, all of our grandparents had passed on prior to our births.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you for this. If things come to mind that you would like to continue this interview, let me know.
Okay. I will look up some of the dates that you asked about. And when Ira gets back to town, I will talk to him because there's might be things that he can remember. But, my point is, ask when you can. If something comes to mind, just ask, because after a while, there's nobody left to ask. I mean, now my mom and all of her siblings are deceased, so I can't ask anybody, and almost with the exception of Wayne, and Ira and his brother, there's nobody left to ask, and they're the oldest, so Edie doesn't know things,
Maybe y'all should get
What,
together.
what is your hope for SAAACAM?
What I would like to see a successful African American museum or history museum here in San Antonio. As I said before, we've had several tries at it, but nothing focused. I think San Antonio suffers from, I don't know, some kind of malaise that just, I don't know. We just cannot seem to get it together. We don't support each other as much as we really should. And it's like, well, that's not my job, or she didn't do that, or, it's like, we just don't have that commitment. So I'm really hoping that with an outside push that we can get our act together and keep something that's permanent, because, we've tried. I mean, the closest thing we've got is the
That
Carver.
house?
No, the Carver. That's where I got my first library card. It's now the Carver Cultural Center, which is just right there, but that used to be the library,
Tell me about going there as a child.
Oh yeah, I had to go in first grade. Well, I told you I went to kindergarten. Not many kids got to go to kindergarten. Usually you left your child with with a grandparent or somebody else. But I got to go to kindergarten. So I learned to read when I was 5, and I knew arithmetic. And then when I went to first grade, where most children started, I could already read, and the little worksheets I could do. So I'd help the other kids. If they were having trouble doing something, I'd help them. And finally, my teacher called my mother in and said, "We really need to find something for Debbie to do because she's not my assistant teacher. I don't need an assistant." So she said, "I suggest you take her to the library and let her get some books." And so Mom took me to the library that day. I got a library card, got a stack of books that I took to school. And when I finished my work, I had to sit and read and not bother anybody else. So I spent a lot of time at that library, taking books out, taking them back. Matter of fact, I got in trouble because I thought you had to take them back the next day. So after school, I walked from CUNY over to the Carver to take the books back. Well, the lady who kept me at school was worried. My mother was worried. "Where have you been?" I said, "Well, I took the books back. You said they were just borrowed. I had to give them back." And she's like, "You don't have to give them back the next day."
That's some fast reading,
Yeah.
too.
But anyway. All right,
Well,
thank you.
I think our time is up.
Thank
And
you.
it's been such a pleasure.
I'll get this back to you for your records.